Welcome to Enact Talk. I'm your host, Wil'Liam Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 26, Matthew chapter 23, with our beloved Rabbi from Canada, Rabbi Michael Skobac. Rabbi, how are you tonight? It's good to see you.
It's great to be seen. It's great to see you, and it's great to be here.
That's awesome. I tell you what, it's been a really, really awesome week. The temperature did drop. Everything's nice and cooled off. Well, during the night anyway. During evening times, it's actually better. So, but anyway, yeah, it's been a really interesting, very, very busy season. And I'm saying that, and I'm not even a rabbi. The rabbis, I'm sure, are going nuts, just trying to keep up. You know, I know you've got very good reason to be going AWOL for the past 2 days. That's for sure, right?
You know, the month that we're in now is called the 7th month. It's called in the Bible the Chodesh HaShvi'i, 7th month. And we know that it has, you know, almost all the Jewish holidays.
Right.
As Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. And the word Sheva, 7, also is related to the word Sava, which means satiated, full. So it's also a very full month, right? It's a month that's satiated and it's filled up with holidays. So yeah, that's been like a major part of our lives past few weeks. This past few days, Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah was absolutely incredible. You know, but at the same time, I think we have to, as we're going into the program tonight, just keep in mind the situation in Israel. You know, keep the people there in our prayers, because it's getting a little bit hairy
Sure.
for many reasons. You know, it's never easy there, but it seems like things are really heating up in many ways. So I'd like to just begin tonight, you know, by asking everyone to, if they just could keep a little bit extra prayer intention on having some more peace and quiet in the Middle East. That would be great. And I don't think we're going to have the end of the world this week. Maybe next week when we get to Matthew 24, we'll look at the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah. So maybe that was just a subliminal teaser for next week. I was so confused, Rabbi. Oh my gosh.
People love the end of the world stuff, and I think actually there were some Christian websites predicting that I think either today or tomorrow the world's going to come to an end and be destroyed. There's been quite a lot of predicting.
Wow.
So I think that I'm not so convinced the world's going to end so quickly.
Right.
Because we have a lot of stuff to do on this program.
Sure enough. No kidding.
We have a lot of programs to do yet before the end of the world.
Indeed.
So you ready to begin?
Yeah, real quick question. Sheva, does that also have a connotation of an oath?
Yeah, actually, Shavua is an oath. That comes up in tonight's program, actually. We're not going to talk about it, but
sure,
oaths come up, and it's related to quite a few different words. But in terms of, you know, the significance of this 7th month, it's known as the month that's really full. It's totally filled up with holidays. And interestingly, the next Hebrew month is called Mar Cheshvan. Mar means bitter, because it's the only month that really has no holidays at all.
Got it.
So, you know, but I think the real, not the challenge so much, but really what we're supposed to really be doing is never just going through these holidays and moving on. We're supposed to really bring them into the rest of the year. We're supposed to really incorporate everything we've experienced in these holidays into the rest of the year, into the rest of our lives. So we don't just, you know, celebrate the holidays and move on. We're supposed to really try very hard to really integrate them into who we are. And that really was the purpose of the last days of Sukkot. You know, the Bible speaks about having this holiday of Sukkot, the festival of where we live in the booths, tabernacle. But then there's an extra day at the very end, which there's no mitzvot. We don't sit in the sukkah. We don't take the four species. It's just a day that's really dedicated to trying to bring everything in to our being, to try to integrate and incorporate all the lessons, all the inspiration that we've gained since the beginning of this holiday season into our consciousness for the rest of the year. And that's how we ended yesterday. It was really quite amazing to be able to do that. Now in Israel, they have Shmini Atzeret, that one final day, and Simchas Torah, the celebration of the completion and beginning of the Torah. It's all on the same day. Outside of Israel and diaspora, we split it up into 2 days.
Right.
But really, that's how we're going to be able to integrate all of the inspiration and all of the lessons and all of the new growth and ideas of the holidays that comes only through the Torah itself. And that's really how we ended it in the diaspora yesterday, just by taking the Torah and hugging it and dancing with it and just showing how much we love the Torah. And that's the lifeline that we have to really hold on to during the entire year. And with that lifeline, we're going to try and look at the Christian scriptures tonight.
There you go.
From a Jewish perspective.
Right,
So chapter 23 of Matthew, I would say this is where it gets personal because, it's funny. A couple of months ago, I was in a Jewish bookstore, and the person that was behind the counter was pointing nervously to the back. There were 3 huge bikers. They were Christian bikers, and she didn't know what to do with them, how to handle them. So I just sort of ambled over to them, and they asked me, "Can I ask a question?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "What are these wings over here?" They were pointing to a talit, to a prayer shawl. They were calling it wings. And they wanted to know about the wings. And I said, "Well, what do you want to know?" And they said, "Can we buy a set?" And I said, "Well, why do you want to buy, this prayer shawl?" I said, "Well, we want to buy something that will remind us of Jesus."
Wow.
And I said, "Well, do you know what they're really for? Do you know what the real purpose is?" And they said, "No, not really." So I showed them in Numbers 15 that the tzitzit, the ritual fringes, are there to remind us to keep all the commandments of the Torah. And I said to them, I am assuming you guys aren't keeping all the commandments of the Torah. You're not circumcising your kids. You're not observing the dietary laws. You're not observing the Shabbat and the Jewish holidays. So it's not really something that you're interested in doing, to have this reminder to observe all the commandments of the Torah. And they said, "Well, I guess you're right." And I said, "Well, for Jewish people, the prayer shawl it's a very holy garment. It's something which is not treated casually. We treat it with a lot of respect. And to use it for a purpose it wasn't intended for, it's not really respectful." And I said, "I don't think that it's the right thing for you to do is to buy a prayer shawl for that purpose." And they agree with me. And so they said, "Well, what should we do?" And I said, "Well, this bookstore," I said, "all the books in this bookstore were written by Pharisees. Every single one of them." And I said, in Matthew 23, Jesus begins the chapter by saying that the Pharisees and the scribes, they sit in the seat of Moses, and therefore everything that they teach you, you should do. So I said, here, your Messiah is basically telling you to follow the teachings of the Pharisees. So I said, my recommendation is, if you want to do something, want to buy something that might remind you of Jesus, I said, get a book that's written by some Pharisees, and maybe you'll think of Jesus a little bit. And they said, well, what do you recommend? So I pulled off the shelf Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot.
Nice.
I said, this is a book that was not just written by Pharisees. I said, this was written by Pharisees, many of whom lived 2,000 years ago at the time of Jesus. And I said, buy this book, read the teachings, and maybe it'll be helpful. And I think that it's important, I think, for Christians who are reading this chapter to realize that they're getting a very one-sided, prejudiced, biased, ugly take on who the Pharisees were, and they shouldn't just take my word for it. I think that the simplest way of finding out about who anyone is to take a look, meaning that the Pharisees left behind thousands and thousands of pages of teachings. You could read about their lives. You could see what kind of people they were and what they taught and what they represented. And that's all a person would need to do to really see if what, the presentation in Matthew 23 is one that's accurate. So we'll just begin where Jesus basically says here that, and he's speaking to the multitudes and his disciples, and he says that the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Therefore, whatever they teach you to observe, that you should do and observe. So Jesus here seems to be giving, his credence. He's giving credence to, and he's giving credibility to, his stamp of approval to, and his directive to his students to follow what the Pharisees teach. Now, I think it's important, I'll try and do this quickly, to explain that there really are several aspects to the teachings of the Pharisees. Meaning that when we speak about what the Pharisees taught, there were at least 4 things they taught, and I'll try and go through them quickly. First of all, the Pharisees, the most central part of who they were the transmitters, the teachers and the transmitters of what we call the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, these are the teachings that God revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai that were not written down in the 5 books of Moses. So, for example, the 5 books of Moses speak about afflicting your soul on the Day of Atonement. It doesn't explain how you afflict your soul. It doesn't say if that means to sit with an insurance salesman for 2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Does it mean to listen to disco music? I mean, how do you afflict your soul? So the oral Torah explains that afflicting your soul involves not eating, not drinking, not having sexual relations, etc., not bathing, not anointing yourself. So the oral Torah basically explicates. It gives you the understanding of all the aspects of the written Torah that are not cleared up in the written Torah. So the written Torah, for example, obligates people in the observance of the Torah itself. But at what age does someone become obligated? When is someone responsible for observing the Torah? That's not written in the Torah itself. We don't know if it's the age of 10, 13, 15, 18, 21. So the oral Torah explains all those issues. And the truth is that there's very little that's clear by the written text itself. The written text says that if you want to eat meat, you have to slaughter the animals, God says, as I've commanded you. But there's no commandment in the written text on how to slaughter an animal. So the oral Torah explains exactly how animals are to be slaughtered. The Bible speaks about putting certain things as frontlets between your eyes and a sign upon your arm. It's going to come up in tonight's chapter. Well, what does it mean to put a sign upon your arm and frontlets? What are frontlets, and how do you do that? So all of the things that are not clear, that are not spelled out, that are vague in the written text are explained, spelled out in the oral Torah. And basically there are numerous examples, I mean far more than we could give tonight. I'm just going to focus on one. The written text of the Torah says don't do any melacha on the Sabbath. And it says that it's a capital crime to do melacha on the Sabbath. And it's a word which is not easily translated. There's no other place in the Bible where the word is used. And the person who's concerned about observing this law of God would really be interested in knowing what is melacha. And so the oral Torah explains that the melacha encompasses 39 conceptual categories of activity. One of them is writing. So even though we don't find in the written text of the Torah a prohibition against writing, the oral Torah says we're not allowed to write. So one of the things that the Pharisees did as the teachers of the oral Torah, of the teachers of the oral Torah, the Pharisees, is they transmitted the teachings of the oral Torah. The second thing that the rabbis did, however, was to enact safeguards to protect Torah law. So, for example, the Torah prohibits having sexual intercourse with certain people. But the Torah doesn't prohibit hugging and kissing them or being in a locked room together with them. But the sages, the Pharisees, said, look, if you're not supposed to be having intercourse with someone, it's probably a good idea not to hug and kiss them and to be in a locked room together with them. So these Pharisees enacted legislation that prohibited people from doing this. Or if the Torah law says that we're not allowed to write on the Sabbath, the sages, the Pharisees, would say, you know what, better you don't walk around on the Sabbath holding a pen or a pencil, because you're so used to writing, so sometimes unconsciously, you'll probably come to write if you're holding a pen or a pencil on the Sabbath. So these are the kind of safeguards that the rabbis instituted to protect the actual Torah legislation. And it wasn't considered to be adding to the Torah. We know that in the book of Deuteronomy, we're not told that we're not allowed to add to the Torah. But the rabbis here were not adding to the Torah because they had to be very clear when they formulated this kind of legislation that they were enacting rabbinic legislation. And it wasn't to be treated as Torah law. So, for example, we know that Torah law, there was a capital punishment, theoretically at least, for violating the Sabbath. So a person that was writing on the Sabbath, that could be a capital crime. But the rabbis couldn't put someone to death for just carrying a pen on the Sabbath. That was their rabbinic protection of the Torah law itself. Are we okay there?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Was I putting too much background noise?
It sounds like there's some kind of a riot going on there in your studio.
I just ran them off. You're good. Sorry about that. I forgot to mute my
I hope that you didn't hurt them too badly. So the two aspects of the oral of the what the Pharisees taught that we've mentioned so far, the Pharisees taught the oral Torah that was transmitted to God by God to Moses. The Pharisees enacted legislation to safeguard Torah law. It's like, so when you go into a train or a subway, there's a yellow line right near the tracks to tell people don't go up until the very edge of the track. Right? That's a bad idea. So they paint a yellow line to make sure you don't go to the very, very end and you can easily fall in. And that's what the rabbis did. The rabbis painted this yellow line to protect us from violating the Torah law itself. The third thing that the rabbis did, the sages did, Pharisees did, was to enact positive enactments to enhance Torah living in Judaism. For example, they enacted the holiday of Hanukkah. It's not a biblical holiday. This is a rabbinic holiday. Or they enacted the idea of lighting candles for Shabbat to enhance the beauty of Shabbat. So the Pharisees would enact positive legislation to enhance Judaism. Again, they weren't adding to the Torah because they never claimed that these were Torah laws. They always made it clear these were rabbinic laws. And finally, the Pharisees were the ones that were empowered to decide cases of doubt. Now, it's important to understand that the authority of the Pharisees, the authority of the rabbis and the sages, was not something they arrogated to themselves. This is something that God decided, God allocated, God really gave them this authority. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 17, and we see earlier examples where God told Moses to appoint elders to make decisions in terms of the law because, God himself decided not to be always stepping in and telling us what to do every single day. Meaning God revealed the Torah at Mount Sinai, and God is basically saying to us, I'm now giving you the Torah for you to work with, to have judges, to have lawyers, to have legal experts. God could have said to us, look, I don't trust you as human beings, and I'm going to come every need and I'll give you more instructions. God does not take that approach with us.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting that Christians have a tremendous amount of difficulty with this idea that there are things that we have to follow that are not in the Torah, not in the scriptures themselves. So, for example, John MacArthur, I've mentioned him in the past, one of the foremost evangelical commentaries to the New Testament today. He says that Jesus was only teaching his disciples to follow the Pharisees when the Pharisees are teaching what the Torah itself says. Now, the problem with that kind of interpretation is if that was Jesus' intent, If Jesus was only telling us to listen to those people who happen to teach us what it says in the Torah itself, then Jesus would have said that we should follow the Sadducees, because the Sadducees were the ones that did not believe in an oral Torah.
That's a good point.
So this is a very, very problematic interpretation. Another interpretation I saw was David Stern, who's a very famous Messianic teacher. And he wrote in his commentary to the New Testament that Jesus did not accept the oral Torah or the rabbinic teachings. And he claims that Jesus transferred authority to the Messianic leaders. That's where he says the authority is. Now, I think there are many problems with this interpretation. Number one, we know that the disciples of Jesus were not learned men. So these are not the kind of people you would entrust with the authority to interpret Torah law or to really be leaders in any kind of legal way. They were in many ways, illiterate. They were not learned. They were simple people. It's hard to imagine why Jesus would give them the authority to be the legal decisors of the movement. Secondly, the text here in Matthew 23 doesn't indicate that the authority was now being transferred to the disciples of Jesus. He seems to be saying here, no, it's in the seat, it's in the authority of the Pharisees and the scribes. He says these are the people that sit in the seat of Moses. Therefore, Jesus says everything they teach you, you have to do and you have to follow. It's interesting that today, I've been around today's Messianic movement for about 30 years. I've watched it very carefully. It seems to me that today, the vast majority of Messianic leaders today either tacitly or unwittingly give their assent to the oral Torah, to the Pharisees, to Rabbinic Judaism, because if you look at the way Messianic Judaism practices Judaism, it's basically not following what the text of the 5 books of Moses teaches. It's really following pretty much straight down the line what Rabbinic Judaism has taught since its inception. The fact that they have a wedding, doing a wedding exactly the way Rabbinic Jews do weddings with a chuppah. They have their bar mitzvah at 13, just coincidentally the way Rabbinic Jews do. They happen to make tzitzit just the way Rabbinic Jews do. The ones that wear tefillin, phylacteries, do it exactly the way Rabbinic Jews do. They celebrate Hanukkah, which is not in the Bible. They all, if you ask them what Jewish year it is this year, they'll say it's the same Jewish year that the rabbis pronounce. Meaning there isn't anything, basically, that happens in the Messianic movement that isn't essentially copying, mimicking the way Rabbinic Jews practice Judaism.
Right.
So at the end of the day, when Jesus said that you're supposed to be following the scribes and the Pharisees, even though you'll often hear in the Messianic movement this refrain that we follow the word of God, not the traditions of men, this is exactly what the Messianic movement does. They follow the traditions of the Jewish sages, the Pharisees. I remember being at a conference of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations and taking a poll of members when they celebrate the holiday of Shavuot. Because we know that Shavuot is supposed to be celebrated in the Bible. It says 50 days after the Sabbath. And according to the oral Torah, the Sabbath here basically is referring to the first day of the holiday of Passover. Sometimes the holiday is called a Shabbat. Now we know that the Sadducees, who did not accept this oral Torah teaching, they always had Shavuot falling on a Sunday, meaning that 50 days after the Sabbath would be on a Sunday. For Pharisees and Rabbinic Jews and people who follow the oral Torah, Shavuot is not always on a Sunday. It happens to come out 49 days after the first day of Passover. And my findings were that the vast majority of Messianic Jews celebrated Shavuot on the same day that traditional Jews did. And when I asked them why they did it that way, they quoted for me Matthew 23, that they're supposed to follow the teachings of the Pharisees. So it's a huge topic. Unfortunately, we don't have several months tonight. We only have this hour.
Rabbi, I would like to add one thing to kind of confirm something that I did have to actually go through in my learning curve too. The whole thing about the usage of the word work as opposed to malacha. One thing that I was taught, and I get it now, I didn't get it before. In fact, I quite rejected it before, was that malacha, it can include work, but it doesn't mean work. Work was just like...
There's a separate Hebrew word for work.
Tell me, do you know, what is that word?
Yeah, if the Bible was going to tell us you can't do work on the Sabbath, it would have used the word avodah.
Oh, yes, that's right. Thank you. So with that said, to be intellectually honest with myself, I had to say, okay, if every time I see work in English where it says you shall do no work, I really need to completely remove that word entirely and just simply put in the Hebrew word and then find out what the definition for that Hebrew word is.
Well, the problem, by the way, is even if it had said avodah, you'd still be stuck. Because what would it mean?
Right.
If God had said, don't do avodah on the Sabbath, what would that mean?
Well, if I added zerah, I'm just kidding.
What is work? Meaning that some people would define work as going to work. Meaning that, if you, have a job, that you go to, that's what you can't do on the Sabbath. That's really problematic because that would seem to imply that people who don't work don't have a Sabbath to observe.
Right.
Work is also defined in physics. In physics, work is moving any force over a distance. So in physics, if you pick up a cup and you move it from one side of the table to the other, you've done work. That's obviously not prohibited on the Sabbath. So, to say that we can't do work on the Sabbath would be problematic, but it's not the word the Bible chose to use. The Bible used a word which doesn't really have any cognate. There's no other place you'll find this word melacha. It is related to the word malach, which is an angel. And there is some, but that's not for tonight's discussion. But it's a word which cannot be defined by trying to break down the word. No one would know what it meant to say don't do malacha on the Sabbath. It's interesting because you see that later in the Bible there are in some of the other prophetic books, you see there's indications that there had been more revelation than had been just written down in the 5 books of Moses. They're speaking about doing business, which is prohibited on the Sabbath, carrying things, transporting them outside the city, etc. The Sabbath is not simple to just define in 5 minutes. Right. But my point was that if all you had was the 5 books of Moses, you really would have absolutely nothing. Now, the last part I wanted to speak about here is the next sort of backhand compliment that Jesus pays to the Pharisees. He says, even though they have the authority and you have to really follow everything they teach you, in verse 3 he says, but do not do according to their works, for they say and they do not do. Meaning,
that's where the church hangs up right there. They cling to that. And it's really strange.
He's saying they don't practice what they preach.
Right.
But which, is a nasty attack. But again, we shouldn't forget that he is teaching his disciples that what they teach you, what they tell you, you've got to do. But he's saying here, but don't look at them to see how they behave, because he's claiming here they don't practice what they preach. Now, this is going to be something I'm going to say a few times tonight. But I think the most disturbing part about this chapter is that, it engages in these gross blanket generalizations about really a group of thousands and thousands of people. So, it's impossible to imagine that, that none of the Pharisees practice what they preach. I mean, are we really supposed to believe that? But here again, he speaks about the scribes and the Pharisees. It's a blanket generalization. and he's saying that they don't practice what they preach. That's clearly to me the most disturbing part of this entire chapter is that it's really painting with one broad brushstroke not a small group of people, a very large group of people. Now in verse 4 he goes on, and this is a whole chapter really where you're hearing. Now again, I'm not married to the idea that Jesus actually said any of these things.
Right.
He very well might have. I have no way of knowing. But if it turned out that Jesus didn't say any of this, it wouldn't shock me.
Right.
But let's take it at face value that this is really his speech. And it's really one long speech where he's whining about these Pharisees. And he goes on and he says, they. If you look at how many times, by the way, the word they appears in this chapter, that's the giveaway word. Imagine, any person in the world today speaking about any other group of people, that they are all lazy, they are all cheap.
Right.
Really, all 2 million of them. They're all, it's really quite disturbing. So he claims here that they bind heavy burdens that are hard to bear, meaning that these rascally rabbis, they make up these very, very difficult laws for people to follow, and he's criticizing them for this. And then he goes on to say, but all they really want to do is get notoriety. They want to be seen by men. They want to be noticed by men. He goes on to accuse them of broadening their phylacteries and making their tassels, the tzitzit, larger so people will notice them. Meaning it's a long attack on people, he claims, that are only interested in notoriety and prestige and honor. So again, I think that it's these very gross generalizations about an entire group of people that comprise thousands and thousands of people that really punctures the credibility of Jesus's critique.
I find it interesting that he didn't criticize them for wearing phylacteries or for wearing tzitzit. Right? He just said because they were making them too big to make them noticeable.
So what's clear here is that he's not disputing the idea of the way the Pharisees made phylacteries. Now again, if you were only to have the text of the 5 books of Moses, you wouldn't get from the phrase "a sign upon your arm" and "frontlets between your eyes," "totafot" between your eyes. You wouldn't get the black boxes with the parchments that we have, in traditional Judaism for the past 3,000 years.
Well, I have a question on that, and actually, this is something that really I think Hashem used. It kind of pierced my heart on it because while I was criticizing what I saw in Judaism about wearing the black boxes and the strap around their arm, while I was actually criticizing them for this, I actually had a mezuzah on my doorpost. And one Shabbat, I was reading in Deuteronomy chapter 6, I guess. 6. And I saw this thing about the mezuzah. Hey, there's a mezuzah thing. And then all of a sudden, it's like I just got spiritually slapped. And it's like, read the rest of that. And I'm sitting here looking at this. I'm like, well, if I take the literal factor of writing them and put them as a sign on my doorpost, but then I say I don't want to take the literal factor of binding it as a sign upon your hand, then my understanding of how to read and interpret anything is really messed up. So I either have to ditch the mezuzah, which I was not willing to do, or I need to stop criticizing the Jewish people for wearing phylacteries, as the New Testament calls them. And it was a real eye-opener, a major eye-opener for me.
Well, that's a good point. I'm glad you caught yourself there. But, it's interesting because, those people who only accept the written text of the 5 books of Moses, if that's all there is, they would have their right to say, well, it's not to be understood literally when it speaks about putting them as, a sign upon your arm and frontlets between your eyes. It's just a way, it's an expression that you should have these things close to you, and it doesn't mean you should actually write it, on your doorpost. It's a way of saying, a person could take that hermeneutic approach and say it's an expression for how you should incorporate the teachings of the scriptures into your life.
Okay, question.
You'd have that interpretation. But again, God had a say here. And in the oral Torah, God explained to us it's not to be understood symbolically, that we're actually supposed to do these things in a very precise way.
Rabbi, there's
Yeah.
one more thing that I would like clarification on. In the Hebrew, does it say as latodefot beinenecha? Is that between your eyes plural, or is it between? I know it sounds a really strange question. I mean, between your eye, that's not even practical. However, the reason why I'm asking this is because I'm pretty sure the Hebrew says bind it as a sign upon your hand, not hands, right? And so
it's on your arm, really.
On your arm.
Hand.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
But not on your arms, plural.
No.
So therefore, that really pushes the idea that that is definitely not metaphorical, because if it was, it would just, like you say, well, everything your hand does, do it with all your might. No, your hands are plural. Like if it qualifies your eyes as plural, why would it not qualify your arm as plural also if it was metaphorical?
Oh, no, because the expression between your eyes, would mean that it's going to be in the center between your eyes. You need both eyes to be able to get to the center. And it does say, bein, enecha, between. So the word between requires to have two things on either side. So there you'd have to have both eyes.
Okay.
But it's interesting because we don't actually put the tefillin, the phylacteries, between our eyes. It's really set up further on the top of the head, but in the center of the head, which would be, when you take a line, it's between the eyes, but not. It's not worn over here, right over here.
Right. But technically, it is between your eyes, right?
Yeah, it's not off to one side and the other side. It's over here. And again, this is all spelled out exactly how it should be done in the oral Torah. It's interesting that, here you have Jesus allegedly critiquing the Pharisees for the heavy burdens they're placing upon the people, in the sense that, they make Judaism so difficult. But, it's hard to really take that accusation seriously in light of the Sermon on the Mount, because in the Sermon on the Mount, he has extremely rigorous demands of his followers. He sets standards that, would be way beyond what the rabbis ever taught in terms of strictness. So, on the one hand, he's criticizing the sages here for their imposing heavy burdens in terms of what people are required to do. But the standards that he set in the Sermon on the Mount go way beyond what the Torah actually requires, and are just about impossible to observe. So I think that's a little bit of a double standard.
Okay.
Now, it's important to realize that, throughout Jewish history, there have been movements who criticized the enactments of the rabbis. They said, look, the rabbis are making it too difficult. The rabbis are making Judaism too burdensome. It's impossible to keep. The truth of the matter is that the only Jews that survived throughout history have been the Jews who have been following the observance of the Torah according to the way the rabbis have taught it. And throughout history, all of the groups that wanted to do away with the teachings of the rabbis have disappeared. Not just disappeared, but they were groups that themselves dropped all Torah observance. So it's not a coincidence that, here at least either Jesus or someone putting these words into his mouth, this is the foundation, this is the origins of Christianity, begin with this attack on the Pharisees. And yet it didn't take very long, probably within 100 years, that the vast majority of people who claimed to be followers of Jesus no longer kept the Sabbath at all, didn't keep any form of kashrut, of keeping kosher, didn't wear tefillin, didn't wear tzitzit at all, didn't observe the Sabbath, didn't observe any of the Jewish holidays, didn't circumcise themselves or their children, didn't check their clothing for shotness, which is wool and linen mixed together, didn't observe the laws of ritual purity of husbands and wives that the Bible mandates, meaning that the people historically who whined and complained about the burdens being imposed by the rabbinic sages, these are people that inevitably stopped observing any of the Torah. And it's precisely those Jews today, if you wanted to go around the world today and find those Jews who sacrifice in order to be able to observe Judaism, they will make sure that they will move to neighborhoods where it may be a little bit more expensive, but they want to be within walking distance of a synagogue, and where you'll find that, there's a tremendous amount of joy in the observance of their Torah. It's precisely those Jews who observe the Torah as explicated by the Pharisees and the sages. It's important to take note of that. Another thing that happens in this portion, if you just move on a little bit, is he says that the rabbis, they love to be called rabbi because they're just so hungry for honor. So Jesus says that you shouldn't call anyone rabbi. And don't call anyone father, don't call anyone teacher. Most people don't really think he was saying these things literally. It's interesting that according to many, many authorities, and I think this is probably true, this is probably an anachronistic entry in Matthew, meaning that it sort of indicates that Matthew here is not really giving you the words of Jesus, who was, speaking around the year 30 approximately, because it seems that the term rabbi, the title rabbi, was not used in the first century. And the earliest it really came into use was later on after the destruction of the temple. So here he'd be making this speech about not calling anyone rabbi, and that all the people that were seeking glory wanted to use this title. In all likelihood, it was not a title that was being used. If you go through Ethics of the Fathers, for example, and you see the teachers of the first century, they were just called by their name. Yossi ben Yoezer, Yossi the son of Yoezer, Hillel, Shammai. The rabbis just had their names, sometimes the name of their father afterward. But the title rabbi was not really used until later on in the first century. So this seems to be sort of a proof that Matthew here is sort of writing backwards into history. Another thing I just wanted to point out, and we've done this many times, is we've discussed whether or not Jesus in Matthew is claiming to be God himself. And it seems that almost all the references we've seen, Jesus is distinguishes himself from God, and that seems to be the case here as well. Because he says, don't call anyone rabbi, because you only have one rabbi, which is me, the Messiah, basically. And then he says, don't call anyone father, because you only have one father, and he's your father in heaven. And then he says, don't call anyone teacher, because you only have one teacher, and that's the Messiah. So he distinguishes himself, the Messiah, from God up in heaven. He's not equating himself here with God in heaven. I'll just tell you a quick story. I know we're going late tonight. I was once invited to speak at a Christian seminary, and they asked me how they should introduce me to the class. Class of about 100 students. And they said, should we introduce you as Rabbi Skobac? And I said, well, it's against what your scriptures teach. You shouldn't call anyone rabbi. And the professors looked at me and they said, no, it doesn't say that in the New Testament. And I said, yes, it does. And they said, no, it doesn't. And I said, yes, it does. And they said, no, it doesn't. And I said, whatever. I didn't want to get into it.
That's
so
funny.
they bring me into the class and they say, look, Rabbi Skobac is uncomfortable being called rabbi because it's against the scriptures. Anyone familiar with where it says that? And none of the students knew where it was.
Wow.
And I was sure that as soon as I left the room, they're going to all whip out their concordances and find out the great irony that the only person who knew that verse in the book of Matthew that day
was the
rabbi.
Jew.
Was the rabbi.
That's funny.
Anyway, let's go on.
Okay.
Verse 13. So he goes on, this is a whole chapter of woes against the scribes and Pharisees, and he calls them hypocrites. And he goes on to really rail against them. It's important to realize that if you check out almost all modern dictionaries and you look up the word Pharisee, it's defined as a religious hypocrite. It doesn't say Pharisee. Normally the first entry is not going to be the religious teachers in the first century, which would have been more accurate. It becomes a synonym, really. Pharisees becomes synonymous with a self-righteous hypocrite, a religious hypocrite. And clearly the dictionaries get this from Matthew 23. And, it's so sad that these, compilers of the dictionaries probably never spent any time reading and studying the works of the sages, of the rabbis. Who were these men from their own perspective? Rather than reading some slanderous account about them, why not just spend some time reading what they taught, reading about their lives, how they live their lives, and see, what these people are really like. And it's interesting that many Christian scholars over the past several hundred years who bothered to do this walked away with a tremendous amount of respect for the Pharisees. Now, some commentaries, because I think they were so embarrassed by this chapter, have insisted that Jesus is not really attacking all the Pharisees here, only some of the Pharisees. But I think the language that's being used here sort of shows that's not the case. He seems to be very clearly attacking a whole entire group. Then in verse 15, this is a long story. He attacks the scribes and Pharisees as hypocrites because they travel throughout the whole world to convert one proselyte, to make one convert. And when he's converted, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. I mean, obviously what he's saying here is that the rabbinic leaders are basically going to deprive people from going to the world to come, the kingdom of God, going to heaven, because they reject him as the Messiah. And so when they take someone who was not Jewish and bring them into Judaism and teach them, their approach, which does not include accepting Jesus as the Messiah, he's saying, look, you're going to drag this person to hell with you. It's not clear what he's talking about here, meaning is he saying that this was normal behavior for the Pharisees to take trips all over the world to try to convert people? There actually happens to be a one famous story where some of the rabbis travel to Rome and they actually convert a nephew, I think, of Titus. So it probably, I would think here, it's a reference to that one story, and it's not describing what was normally done all the time as routine. In verse 16, he goes on to again attack them as blind guides. Here he's attacking them really for the oral Torah's teachings on the laws of oaths. And we won't have time to really go into his misunderstanding tonight of how those laws worked. But I want to point out one thing, that in verse 19, he calls them fools. Now, earlier in the chapter, he accused the Pharisees of not practicing what they preached. And it's interesting here, they always say that when you point your finger, you've got three pointing right back at yourself. Well, if you just go back to Matthew chapter 5, verse 22, Jesus says, if you call anyone a fool, you're going to go to hell. So here he himself basically said that it was not right to call people fools, and yet in this chapter 23 of Matthew, it's exactly what he does. It's what he calls the Pharisees. We'll move on to verse 23. And again, it's woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites again, because you pay the tithe of mint and anise and cumin, but have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. Now, we know that biblically there was a requirement to tithe your crops, and it probably did not include tithing these spices. It really meant the produce, like grains and fruits and vegetables. And something that was like these little teeny plants, like the spices, would not have been required biblically. But rabbinically, there was an idea of tithing these things as well. And basically, the tithe was a portion of a person's crop that went to the priests and the Levites, because we know the priests and the Levites did not have any land. They were basically supported by the rest of the nation because they were the teachers. They worked in the temple, but they were mainly the teachers of the people. The average priest did not really work in the temple more than a few days in the year. So during the rest of the year, they spent their time teaching. And because they were dedicated to teaching, they didn't have time to harvest and to plow and to plant. So they were supported by these tithes. And basically, because there were many, many more Levites than priests, the priests got what was called truma. And the truma was approximately a 60th of a person's crops, about 2% approximately. And then after people gave that 2% to the priests, the next 10% of their crops went to the Levites. And then there was a second tithe that went to, in the 7-year sabbatical cycle, in the 3rd and the 6th year of the sabbatical cycle, the second tithe, meaning that second 10%, would go to poor people. And in the 1st, 2nd, and 4th and 5th years, people had to take that second 10% wherever they lived in Israel and bring it to Israel and spend that money in Jerusalem. So there were all these tithes, and Jesus here is criticizing the Pharisees and the scribes for tithing mint and anise and cumin. And he makes the claim that they're neglecting the really more important things in life, like justice, mercy, and charity and faith. But what's important to see here is that Jesus does not criticize the tithing in and of itself, meaning he says that these you ought to have done, meaning you should have given the tithes without leaving the others undone, meaning that you should be doing both, Jesus says. So many people assume that Jesus here is, again, attacking the observance of the Torah law, but the truth is he's actually not. He's specifically saying you should be making these tithes. And again, I want to emphasize, even though tithing the mint and the spices is not biblically required, it's only rabbinically required, and yet Jesus accepts that it should be done. And again, I want to emphasize it's outrageous to portray all the Pharisees as people unconcerned with tikkun olam, with social justice, with mercy, with charity, with faith. Again, because these values were the most central things that the rabbis taught about. I mean, anyone that just spent a little bit of time studying the writings of the sages, ethics of the fathers, for example, will see that these very values are at the very center, the very core of what the Pharisees, what rabbinic Jews taught. By the way, I want to refer people viewing to a wonderful book called Permission to Receive by Rabbi Leib Kellerman. And in this book, he quotes a number of very, very important studies showing that when it comes to charitable giving, Jewish people are really way out above all other religious groups in the world. So, you know, it's interesting that here the Jewish leaders are being attacked for not really being concerned with social welfare and charity and faith, etc. And yet, this is the main thing they taught, and we see the proof is in the pudding. This is an area that Jews have always excelled in, as opposed to this teaching here. Now, again, you know, throughout these attacks on the Pharisees, it's true. We know that there were some Pharisees, there were some bad apples that were more concerned with their honor and prestige than anything else, and they were criticized for it. They were attacked by the main, you know, stream groups of Pharisees. But the truth is that these same kinds of problems crept into the early church, and when you go through some of the epistles in the New Testament, you know, 2 Peter, I think, and 2 Timothy, they have chapters devoted to attacking, you know, inappropriate church leaders. Right. So it's not as if any group of people in the world is free of having leaders who just seem to stray, but to portray all of the group like these few bad apples is really criminal as far as I'm concerned. We're going to wrap up now. If we could, we'll go to verse 29. just point out something interesting, that we've had this a number of times in Matthew. That's why I'm emphasizing it, that he speaks here about the monuments of the righteous. It's a part of the attack against the Pharisees, that they build tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous. He goes on to attack them and says, they say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. We wouldn't have been those who murdered the prophets. But he does say here that there were people who were righteous. And this is something, again, that we see Jesus, especially in the book of Matthew, mentions many times, that there are righteous people. And this is in direct contradiction to what Paul later teaches throughout his writings, that there are no righteous people. Mm-hmm. In verse 31, he really begins to conclude his attack against the Pharisees by saying, of all the things that you do, you're hypocrites and you're vipers and you're snakes, and you're concerned only with honor and only with looking good to the outside, but inside you're corrupt. It's a long list of really ugly accusations against them. And here he basically accuses them of murder, that they basically are part of this line of Jewish people who are guilty of killing everyone all the way back to the righteous Abel, who was killed by his brother Cain. Wow. We'll read about it in this week's Torah portion, Bereshit. Of course, there were no Jews living at the time of Cain and Abel. So to say that somehow the Jews are going to be held responsible for that murder is absurd. And then he goes on to say that from the killing of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, who you murdered between the temple and the altar. So this is well known to be problematic, because there was no such person who was killed in the temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 to 21, we are told that the person who was killed in the temple was Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. This you'll find numerous commentaries that try to come up with some way of resolving this inconsistency. Some claim it's just a scribal error. Some try to actually offer more complicated explanations. But here Jesus is basically saying that the greatest canard is that the Jewish leaders were the killers of prophets. Of course, that begs the question, who were the people that canonized these prophets? Right. We know that people only became accepted as prophets because the leading rabbis, the leading sages, determined that they were true prophets, not false prophets. And ultimately, it was only the leading Jewish sages that canonized from all the prophets. We had over 1 million different prophets. So the determination of who would be canonized in the Bible was only made by our Jewish sages. So clearly, there were some prophets that were stoned and even killed, but to blame the Jewish leadership, the sages, is absurd, because these are the very people who really determined that these prophets should be considered true prophets and canonized in the scripture itself. Just one comment I'll make as we conclude, sure, which is that at the end of the chapter, there's this lament Jesus over at Jerusalem, meaning here, after spending the whole chapter attacking the leadership of the Jewish people, he says really he wants all along that the Jewish people be gathered under his wings, if they were willing to be accepting him. It's sort of a conciliatory statement he makes. And then he says, I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, I think that it seems, to me at least, that he's distinguishing himself here from God. He's not saying he's God. He's saying he's the one that has come in the name of God, meaning God has sent him. And it seems that throughout Matthew and Mark and even Luke, that Jesus was not seen as God in the flesh. He was really seen more as a representative of God, a servant of God, a Messiah sent by God. But it isn't until you get to John where you see the transition being made that Jesus is more than just a human being. And then as you go through the next few decades in Christian history, Jesus is more solidly redefined really as God in the flesh. But it seems here in Matthew, at this earlier stage, that Jesus is distinguishing himself from God. And many Christian scholars insist that what you're learning here in this last phrase is that Jesus will not return until the nation of Israel accepts him. David Stern, in his commentary to the New Testament, I'll quote, he says, the fact that Yeshua will not return until Israel receives national salvation, he says, is a powerful motivator for evangelizing Jewish people. Meaning that when you think about it, there have been studies that have been done that show that the most highly evangelized group in the world is the Jewish people, meaning outside of Christian circles. Most Christians will evangelize their friends and relatives, their fellow Christians. So most converts to Christianity, let's say to Protestant evangelical Christianity, are probably Christians from other branches of Christendom. Let's say more liberal Protestant groups or Catholic groups. But outside of the realm of Christendom, the most highly evangelized group in the world by far is the Jewish nation, Jewish people. Christians are devoting hundreds of millions of dollars to the conversion of the Jewish people. And one of the reasons is, I believe, that according to the way at least some Christians understand this last verse here in chapter 23, is the belief that Jesus will not return in the second coming until the Jewish people come to faith in him. There's no equivalent belief about the need, let's say, for example, to convert all Buddhists or Hindus or Muslims for Jesus to have to come back. So David Stern gives expression to this idea that the conversion of the Jewish people is really critical in order for Jesus to be able to return. And I think that's just an interesting thing, because it's not really clear what Jesus means, where he says at the end of the chapter here, you will no longer see me again till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So William, I want to bless you and myself and the entire world in the name of the Lord, that we pray that Hashem's name will be blessed by the entire world. That's how our scriptures express the desire that God one day will be the king, acknowledged by the entire world. So with that, again, I want to repeat my prayers for the peace in our Holy Land, peace in Jerusalem, peace throughout the world. And I wish you a week of peace as well.
Rabbi, thank you. And the feeling is highly mutual, believe me. So thank you again, Rabbi, for another awesome episode. Matthew 23, man, one of my favorite chapters. So look forward to next week, where the title of this week's episode will truly come to pass. All right, Rabbi. Love you. Love you, folks. Come check us out again. Go to JewsForJudaism.ca. Follow Rabbi Michael Skobac's work. He's got a lot of fresh videos out there you should check out on YouTube. So TanakhTalk.com, TanakhTalk.proboards.com if you want to join the forums to follow along. You'll find Rabbi Skobac there periodically. I know he's quite strung out with 2 minutes too much to do, but hopefully we'll be able to tag him in there also. So until next time, shalom, shalom, everyone. Love you guys, and we'll see you next time.
חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה.